I think I know what's going on there.
Go on.
I mean, you were right to call it. I don't fully understand. I have an O level in maths and a very low AO statistics, which they made me sit because you're not allowed to give up maths until you're over 16. I then went to the London School of Economics, where I did philosophy. So
I studied philosophy too.
Yeah, so I'm not too embarrassed to tell you. I don't quite understand what the accusation being made about yesterday's announcement is in economic mathematical terms. I do know that if you go to the IFS rather than going to the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph to find out what the IFS has said, they've said, as a minor note to what is a major announcement, the Prime Minister followed in the last government's footsteps by announcing a misleadingly large figure. And then you try and work out why that figure of 13 billion has been used. And the answer is that's the figure you arrive at if you haven't increased defence spending between now and 2027. So if you go to the source, the IFS, rather than just coming on the radio and reading out what the Daily Mail have said about it, if the defence budget would have been otherwise frozen in cash terms, that's how you get to the 13 billion figure. The IFS Associate Director responsible for this story, which he didn't think was a story, which is why he used the phrase as a minor note to what is a major announcement, wrote, "This is, of course, dwarfed by the significance of today's announcement, but it is frustrating nonetheless." So the accusation is that he has used an implausible but technically accurate measure to come up with the figure of 13 billion by telling us what the number would be if defence spending didn't go up at all this year, next year or the year after. So it's not a very big deal. And that's what the IFS say. But Kemi Badenoch has been told or heard someone on the radio or read in the newspaper that it is a big deal. And she's used it as a weapon without understanding what it is that she was trying to say.
Well, it may have been a minor note. However, and the IFS referenced it there, the fact that the Tories did this. And when the Tories did this, they talked about, I think I'm right in saying, £75 billion uplift and compared it to a frozen figure. John Healey, who was then Shadow Defence Secretary, was very rude about it.
But he understood it. She didn't understand the attack line that she was using there.
But I mean, she may have understood it and just have been obtuse so she could keep asking the question. And it is a point of disagreement on basically a policy that they both agree on, which does make it difficult to talk about. And, you know, she used Chagos as well. And actually, I thought it was striking that he actually didn't really respond about Chagos. It sounded like to me, I'm not sure about you, James, that actually the money
you
to
wanted
rent
a yes
out,
or a no there, didn't you? And he didn't give a yes. Is that because if you've got 20 quid and you're due to spend £2 of it on chips, and then I give you another £5, and I say, are you going to be spending any of that extra £5 on chips? It's actually a really silly question. But he could have just said no.
He could have just, I mean, it sounded like to me from listening to that, the answer is yes. Because if the answer was going to be no, and Chagos
But how do you distinguish between the new money and the old money? If you're going to say, are you going to be spending any of the new money on that thing that you were going to be spending some of the old money on? How do you... Anyway, we've got to go to the ads. We'll come back shortly, and I'll read out some of your responses as well. But if you are... I mean, this is not for you, obviously. But if you are going to be using this is for Kemi Badenoch and client journalists, if you are going to be using what the Institute of Fiscal Studies say about something, the best place to go to find out what the Institute of Fiscal Studies says about something is the Institute of Fiscal Studies. It's about being able to admit to yourself that you don't understand something, I think. Psychologically is perhaps the best way to understand it. Let's run through some of your responses. It gets to the point, writes Connor, where you begin to feel a little bit sorry for her. Oops, maybe I'm being patronising. I apologise. I did not mishear Kemi Badenoch accusing somebody else of being patronising.
So I'm going to very, very respectfully slightly disagree with you here, James. She
definitely said
that.
Yeah. That's all I'm
I'm not
asking.
disagreeing with that, absolutely not. I actually thought that he did sound a tiny bit patronising when he was explaining that to her. And it may be because he was explaining it for a second time. It may be because he was frustrated. It may be because he's had 24 hours of people asking questions about this. when he wanted this to be a big win.
because he intended to be patronising.
It may be because he intended to be but I slightly winced as I heard him say that. And it's not the first time I've heard the word patronising in reference to Prime Minister's questions. Other people around Westminster have said he's got to be careful with his tone, because sometimes it does feel like there's a bit of a mismatch, because she's
and there's
not
a male-female dimension to it as well, which doesn't work in his favour.
Exactly.
And there's a huge imbalance in basic intelligence as well, but that's me being patronising.
But somebody said to me, at some stage she's going to snap and she's going to say, stop patronising me, and it's going to be quite powerful. And actually when she said it, I was like, okay, well, there's the moment. I'm not necessarily sure it was quite powerful, but I do think that he needs to be careful. And I think in that moment, actually, she was probably right to call him out.
And as a man listening to a woman, I have to respect that more perhaps than I would if it was coming from a man, because it's a trap into which many of us can fall, even with the best of intentions. Indeed, as Marita says, he was, capital letters, very patronising. And then Joep, which I think is a man's name, says, my response to Badenoch's first question was, that's a really good question. Let's see where it goes. And then the second question came and I thought, and that was it for intelligent questions. John in Leeds says, one trick, Kemi isn't getting any better at this, is she? How can she stand there and go through this routine every week and not feel like a total? And then there's a word I haven't come across before, so it's either a typo or something I'm not going to repeat on the radio, just in case it's rude. I'm sure it isn't John in Leeds. Callum says she actually writes these questions about a week in advance and doesn't deviate from her notes, does she? She's either just not listening or she simply can't process that he'd actually answered the questions. That's not true with regard to the Chagos one, I don't think. And James speaks for a lot of people when he says it's hard to tell if she's being deliberately disingenuous or completely stupid. And finally, Maria says that was an open goal and she hit the post. But you think it was better than in some I didn't hear the one 2 weeks ago, which apparently was the best yet in terms of not going terribly well. Lewis was in the chair. I'd come away from that feeling okay, probably.
I think that's right. I mean, I had the misfortune of watching the PMQs 2 weeks ago, and I actually was genuinely taken aback. It was quite difficult to watch at times. I felt a bit sorry for her. So I think that is in my head, to be honest, because obviously there wasn't a PMQs last week. So actually, I would say that one, well, it was significantly better than the one 2 weeks ago. And actually, I'm afraid I can't remember who texted in, but I thought the first question was good, actually, because that basically it's something that Rishi Sunak started doing after he stopped being Tory leader, when actually I thought his PMQs were at their best when he was no longer Prime Minister and leader of the opposition. Actually saying, you know what, I agree with you. Let's start from a position of agreement and then work out where we go from here. And actually that's what she did in that first question, and asked a pretty sensible question. He didn't really have an answer, but that's okay, I think. I think they're going to work that out. But then, as we've talked about just before the break, I think on the figures, she should have asked that once if she wanted to ask that at all. He explained that, and then we got into the difficulty because then he became patronising, in my words, and also in her words. And actually then on British troops, I thought that was a reasonable question as well, which he answered quite reasonably. Chagos as well, we talked about this, the fact that he didn't really answer. I think Chagos is interesting because it's something the Tories want to make a big deal of, but also there are a few Labour backbenchers and actually a few people in government feeling a bit worried about that deal too as well. So I think that is something that is probably worth her highlighting.
It's also something that we probably should do a bigger explainer on ourselves, because the massive bulk of the negotiation was undertaken by previous governments. But I haven't heard James Cleverly on this, or somebody like that. Were they intending never to do a deal, or were they intending to do a completely different deal?
Well, basically, the negotiations stopped. So they did 11 rounds of negotiations under the previous government, which was started off because there was this advisory from the ICJ that they should give up the Chagos Islands, the government should. And then negotiations stalled or did appear to stop under the previous government. And then there was the 12th round of negotiations under this government. And that's when it all became quite public over the summer that actually they were about to give them away. And of course, the sticking point is about the money and Diego Garcia, which is a military base for the UK and the US.
Ultimately, Donald Trump will probably have, again, we have to wait and see, don't we, because you can't make any predictions about him. On that patronising issue, Katie writes, and she describes herself as a histrionic woman, she writes, Badenoch is the most patronising individual I've observed in a very long time. To accuse Starmer is classic Freudian projection on her part. Can I disagree with Katie, or would that be patronising?
You're very welcome to disagree with Katie.
I think two things can be true at the same time, can't they? So he was patronising, but she is always very patronising.
Yeah,
so
I agree with that.
It's an odd opening to pursue, I think. Oh, anything else?
I think that's it. I thought Ed Davey did well today. I think Ed Davey actually pretty consistently does well at the moment.
He does, doesn't he? Why?
Because he is able to be a bit freer with his language. They see themselves, the Lib Dem see themselves as the party that can be very critical of Donald Trump and can basically say whatever they want at the moment. So I think while the government is very constrained, they're obsessed with this discipline over Donald Trump, the Lib Dems can basically say what a lot of MPs are thinking.
And he is doing. And he's doing it very calmly, isn't he? And you're seeing a big bounce in the polling that I've seen today, albeit we're 4 years out from an election. So I'm always reminded that I think Margaret Thatcher was 20 points behind in 1980 after coming to power in 1979, and we know how that story ends. But the idea that a nice, sensible man is there seems to be sort of reaching parts that other Liberal Democrat leaders since Nick Clegg haven't managed to reach. I
think so. And also, they have their policies that they really, really want to push on. One of them is being very critical of Donald Trump, if you can call that a policy. One is the NHS, one is social care. And, we know those are things that people are really, really worried about. And if the Lib Dems are able to kind of make the point that under them, the NHS and social care would be fixed. I mean, lots of people have promised that the NHS and social care would be fixed under them. It hasn't happened quite yet. But I think that is appealing. I also think if you are a party that isn't about to win power or even nearly about to win power, you can talk about fixing social care in a way that is much easier than people who are about to go into government.
There's some nice work. Dean in Cologne, I think, is a bit warmer towards Kemi Badenoch. Well, he's more of an equal opportunities critic. Keir doesn't give straight, explicit answers either, just like the Tories. He could have given a clearer answer on the Chagos deal funding. He is disappointing. Isaac also picks up on that. It was a strong opening question. He writes, I thought that perhaps she'd be about to put in a strong PMQs and then she completely muffed it. That was awful for Badenoch. The truth lies somewhere between the two. Neither of them will be doing laps of honour around the office, I don't think, after that.
It's funny, isn't it? Because we used to be quite critical, I used to be quite critical of Keir Starmer and PMQs, and I actually don't think he's particularly good at it, although he does seem better with Kemi Badenoch, better than he was with Rishi Sunak.
Maybe.
The irony, of course, that everyone said she was going to wipe the floor with him.
Where did that come from, Aggie? You've been in the lobby. Where did because I didn't watch it very closely. There was so much going on, wasn't there, in the last various Conservative administrations that you kind of tended to focus on people who'd gone a little further down the line of prominence. So where did the idea come from that she was good at this sort of thing?
It's a really good question, because she didn't do a lot of... She didn't do that much media.
No.
There's a sort of suggestion that she was scared of media. I mean, she hasn't done a lot of media since she became leader of the opposition. But I think there is this idea that she shoots from the hip, says what she means, and she can be good at the dispatch box, especially when she was in a department where she was looking after one brief. And so I think she was kind of seen as someone that was very on top of her brief. But to be completely honest, I think she was pretty untested.
And it's not just, so you could say she's good at shooting from the hip, but not when it's a dialogue or an exchange. But that speech she gave yesterday, as Starmer referred to, despite some rumours I've heard about the authorship, it was often incoherent. So what I mean, if you were absolutely, if I gave you a truth serum, what's her greatest strength?
I have seen her able to shine, genuinely. I have seen her able to listen. I've listened to her talk. I'm thinking of when she did an hour-long phone-in with Ian Dale, and I thought she was convincing, coherent and lucid.
Okay.
And I don't know what it was about that forum.
Context, medium.
Context.
Probably
maybe
Ian's lovely manner.
It was probably Ian.
Yeah,
she just talked to Ian more.
So that could be it. If she gets Ian Dale to sit next to her at PMQs, and of course, if it wasn't for that unfortunate episode involving Tunbridge Wells, he could have been sitting next to her at PMQs, and everything would have been okay.
Everything would have been fine.
God,
alas,
talk
wasn't to be.
about the path not taken, eh? Talk about the alternative universe, the counterfactual.